As you know, Smart Key Musings is just a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. Now, why do we want to shift left? Well, I guess it makes business sense to do that, right? Let's take a minute to look at how this works. Ultimately, when we want to deliver clean system, which requires validation, we think of it in terms of testing or detection. We think of it in terms of retesting and ensuring it is more often is checking. And before we embark upon a detailed testing / detection, we do some initial screening. You can call it whatever you want, like sanity and so on and so forth. So we kind of do three kinds of filters in some sense to ensure the system is clean. So early stage, initial screening to know it's okay, and then do a very detailed, thorough test / and check. Now we know that as the system gets bigger, that means we're adding more features, we're adding, changing technologies, etc. We are always challenged with the ability to validate because we have the same, more or less the same time, and we probably don't have extra people or tools, so we always need to optimize. So the real reason for shifting left is to optimize. Now, of course, it makes good sense to find issues as early as you can. But leaving the moral high ground aside, the business reason is, I guess I just want to optimize. So I just don't want to look at it only from screening or detecting or checking, but I also want to think in terms of shift left, which we shall see probably can be looked at in two parts. The act of prevention, the act of preemption. We'll talk about that in a minute. And this continues on. As system gets more and more bigger, we are more and more challenged, and we have always got a capacity challenge. So more than anything else, we are trying to unshackle the capacity so that we can continue to do good work despite the fact that the system is getting larger and larger with time. So keeping this picture in mind, that our whole primary intention obviously is to optimize. So what do? We more often resort to automation. We see that as a big play, which is reasonably correct, but we also see there are other elements that need to come into picture, which are key and critical to make this really meaningful. So let's start by looking and asking a more fundamental question. Okay, we are trying to check, we are trying to detect, we are trying to screen, and obviously we are trying to see how we can pull that forward by left shifting. But before we get there, a simple question is, hey, what are issues you're looking for? And what are those issues that you want to shift left? Right. So we're really asking, do we have a little bit of a clearer idea on the classes or types of issues we want to look at? And if we know that, is it possible for us to say, hey, these could be maybe found a little more earlier, and therefore attempt to do a left shift. So we're trying to, in some sense, set up a goal before we jump onto actions. Right. So let's look at it in a simple tabular picture. We see the life cycle, as you can see, the life cycle of coming up with spec, on design and build and validate and deploy, the classic development life cycle. I remember, just because I put this picture doesn't make it waterfall or agile. It simply means there is spec, there is design, there is an act of construction or building, there is an act of validation, there's an act of deployment. And today, a lot of these is done in a fairly very quick fashion with DevOps and stuff built into it. So given this horizontal flow of various elements, of which while we are building, think of these yellow things on the top as the various types of entities. We are building small components. We are putting them together and calling it features. And as it goes further down, the features get combined to form user requirements, and a set of requirements form a flow. So think of these four yellow things on top as different types of entities that we are trying to validate at different stages. The early stage build, and later stage integration and test. Now, what do these rows represent? I'm kind of dividing this entire notion of issues into about 9 levels and saying, hey, maybe there are issues related to data handling, validation, issues related to interface of which accepts the data, and the issues related to the internal structure, architecture, the way the code is built, the way the resources are consumed, the way the timing is handled. The notion of basic behavior and end-to-end flow behavior, which is 4 and 5. The issues related to environment, when we deploy it in different environments, you have issues. Issues related to attributes of performance, scalability, security, usability, and so on. And final issues related to deployment, migration, installation, configuration, and so on. And finally, of course, the real meaning of expectations. I'm kind of saying, look, maybe there are 9 sets of issues aggregated in 9 levels of quality, which can be now earmarked on this timeline of development across various entities. And then let's ask ourselves, okay, if these were the class of issues, how could I shift left? So let me start putting it here. So as soon as we start building something maybe new, for example, we start with something new. You're saying I'm building a new component. Component, I mean, is a building block. It could be a library, a screen, a task, a function, whatever you may call as the elemental piece that we're building. And then we're putting them together to form a basic behavioral element, which is the feature, which is more from a technical stuff. So what are we saying? We are saying, as a developer, when I'm doing a few things, I expect that the issues related to handling of data, boundaries, some interface issues, orders of data being presented, size of data being sent to me, etc. All these are interface related issues, right? Internal structure, how I have coded, how I have architected. And finally, of course, the basic behavior of that particular feature, right? And those are the kinds of issues that you can find at the early stage of build as a developer, whose primary focus is to build small building pieces and put them together. And as we go further, as different people build components and features and integrate, when you integrate, you start seeing some actual user requirements, and you can actually form an end-to-end flow. And that's where these kinds of issues pop up, which is end-to-end flow related issues, which are behavior, things that related to, okay, it works in certain environments because it's a complex environment of combinations, a variety of elements. Could be some front-end elements, middle elements, back-end elements. So this environment becomes complicated. So we're finding issues related to those. And finally, the notions of attributes and so on. So what are we saying? When we get into the validation stage, certainly we are looking for these classes of issues. And finally, when it comes to saying, okay, more or less I have a whole system, it looks like I can keep in mind that I have test cases, I am doing tests, or I am doing whatever to find potential deployment issues and also seek in some customer feedback so that we can ensure that the expectations are not royally messed up, right? So just to give you the idea, we have tried to partition the picture of saying, in the life cycle, for what, where, right? Given this entire picture now, what do I shift? How do I shift? Which ones do I shift? So first is to say, look, there are early stage issues that I as a developer am fixing. So first is to ensure that we do that very diligently. Whether you call it code review, whether you call it requirements review, earlier stage, which we can talk, but let's talk about early stage code. Could be reviews and inspection and test. That's what this is. So do that diligently. Is that all? No. We can also pull for it. So what are we saying? We can say, look, certain issues that I as a developer should be responsible to find, which relates to these 4 levels at the earlier stage, maybe I can pull forward that. What do you mean by pull forward? I can probably take care of that in the design by putting in certain aspects of testability. I can be sensitive to those defects and ensure that they are not there or could be avoided. Or sometimes if some of them relate to the notional aspect, which means, I'm very clear about certain aspects like data sizes, data formats, and so on. So some of these can be pulled forward, right? So you're really looking at it and saying, look, can these issues be lefted by planning for it at a design stage? And can I have a better sense of clarity in the spec? And that's what we're trying to do most of the time, right? Just to put that in perspective. In a similar fashion, we're looking at validation issues at a later stage, which relate to requirements and flows. You are obviously attempting to validate at that stage. But the question that we're asking is, could I find certain behavioral issues? Could I be sensitive to certain environmental issues? Could I be sensitive to certain attributable issues more often, performance and resource consumption and security, which I can pull forward and take care of it in a design place or in an earlier spec place. If I could do that, then that is also shift left, right? We are not saying that we're pulling all of them into the earliest stuff. What we're really saying is, if I could do a reasonably non-trivial amount of issues that I can pull forward, then I'm able to save capacity and therefore being able to optimize. And then the same final token is about deployment. So we are keeping in mind certain issues related to existing data and migration, existing environments and usage patterns, you know, certain environment, certain deployment related switches, configuration, speeds, sensitivities. And if we can pull forward to that, then maybe some of those issues may not always be a late stage issue. So this is just to kind of decompose the problem by saying it's not just jump on and automate or jump on and put together a process. Let's go through it in a little more interesting manner to decompose the problem of what are we finding, looking for, where, what, and then seeing what of these elements can be pulled forward. Now let's ask ourselves and keep in mind, yes, we are not always building new. We are, for a large part of time, fixing issues, enhancing pieces of code. So we need to keep in mind that whatever that we are building, be it a unit or ultimately which becomes a feature and becomes a requirement and forms a flow, can be a brand new one. So it could be absolutely brand new feature or a brand new flow, or it could be existing ones being enhanced or bug fixed. So what are we meaning when we say shift left of something that is new? What we really talked about, what we're really saying is, hey, it means we're becoming very sensitive to possibly issues that are that could occur on the entity that we are building. And that's what it is. But whereas when you talk about modified, what we're really meaning is the fact that shift left really is about being very sensitive and therefore assessing the impact of the modified entities, be it a feature or a component, or therefore subsequently the feature and flow, and then saying, I am looking at it from, is there a serious impact to other entities, right? So that's a kind of a fine difference that I'm trying to highlight here when it comes to shift left of something that is brand new versus something that is, being enhanced or fixed. Okay. Now, let's talk about a little bit and ask ourselves, so what do I do? We all do a lot of things. It's not that I'm going to present you completely something which is not there. I'm just trying to figure out a more meaningful way to organize this thought and therefore do much more efficiently and much more effectively. So when we say shift left, there are two things. We always use the word called prevent, right? Defect prevention. But truly speaking, this probably can be more broken down into two parts: prevention and preemption. So what's the damn difference? See, prevent is block. More definitively, don't allow that, right? So you're saying that bug will never be there because I have disallowed it. I have done something such that this issue can never get into the system, right? So it is more of a protection. Whereas preemption is one stage later. It is anticipation. It is trying to act early, right? And it's therefore a little more strategic. So you're trying to say, hey, could this be possible? If this bug could be possible, and I know I have not had, I'm not sure that I can prevent it, but how can I possibly act on it early so that the chances of it getting into the system is lower? That's the difference. Okay. So what does this mean then? It means that the first one idea of prevention is hardcore control. And therefore, the only way to be able to do some of these things is to implement a very strong process, or use some standards, or put together some gating criteria on gates. And the method you might use at an earlier stage could be reviews and inspection, which are more static in nature. Whereas when we talk about preemption, we're talking about assessment, early assessment, which is more often dictated by the practice, which depends on techniques and heuristics. Heuristics comes from experience, techniques comes from science and engineering. And therefore, some of the things that we might do as part of the practice would be, can I design in testability? Can I do something like, early stage test and test driven kind of stuff? So those kinds of elements come from the, those kinds of assessment practices is what probably will help us preempt. And what do? Yeah, we can do it obviously on code aspects and non-code aspects. So what do you mean by non-code aspects? Spec and design, right? And in a very similar way, how do we end up doing it? Is there any aid? Yes, there are non-software aids, could be templates and checklists, etc., which are all outcomes of processes. And sometimes there could be software tools that are available, some of which are static checkers, and some of these are dynamic checkers. And some of them are obviously dynamic evaluation tools, which is what we are more often familiar with, automation tool, as we generally say. So that's to put that in the context that, we can decompose the entire problem as prevention and preemption, and understand that one is more of blocking and another is more of anticipation, and so on, right? So let's dig in a little more let's take a little more deeper look into this entire piece by saying, okay, what are we talking about? As we briefly alluded, preempting is to a large degree acting earlier, mitigating, being very proactive. So the mindset that is required is what might go wrong mindset, more of hypotheses, more of scenario planning, figuring out some interesting scenarios, what if scenarios, and so on. So the whole idea here is, to a large degree, is driven by the idea of risk, assessing risk as early as possible, doing as meaningful intervention as possible. And the whole idea is about more of a strategic foresight. Now, in a completely brand new situation where we are building something innovative and brand new, maybe you're not just waiting for a test, you're actually building prototypes, you might be doing early simulations, and they're all methods of preempting potential issues. Not issues related only to construction. Some of them would be construction and feasibility. Some of them could be to get stakeholder approvals and possibly clarify certain ideas. So as you saw in the earlier slides, it could be across all the levels, right? Prototypes and simulation. Some of the classic ones which we probably are very aware is early stage load test. So we may not call it full-fledged load test, for example. We might say, hey, it might be too late for us to do certain tests related to attributes, because if I do find an issue later, I might just have a problem fixing. So can I pull it forward? So what we're really doing is we are doing early avatars, the early instances of some of these attribute related tests like load or scalability or security and stuff like that, to more often assess potential risk. Would I be risky? So one of the simplest ways to think about it is as follows, right? So if I do understand that maybe this particular feature or this particular library that I'm building has a significant bearing on the final performance of the system, because that particular flow is very time sensitive, then rather than looking at it from a test standpoint, I can look at it from an engineering standpoint, and therefore say, aha, if that particular end-to-end flow has a performance requirement of a few milliseconds, let's say X milliseconds, then I would be sensitive to the fact that this particular library or this particular module or this particular feature I'm going to ask, how many times would this be called? And if it find out that this is going to be called, let's say 100 times, then I would know if I've got t milliseconds and if this is going to be 100 times, I have to now apportion a certain amount of time. And therefore, I would be able to evaluate this particular module to find out it is certainly much more lesser than t by 100. And therefore, that becomes an early notion of some of the attribute tests, right? And that's what we do. So you cannot consider it to be a full-fledged system load test. It is more often trying to ascertain that we will not run into a risk, and that's an act of preemption. On the contrary, when you talk about preventing, what we're saying is it does not exist. That problem will not happen. We're going to block it. We're going to eliminate it. And therefore, the mindset is different. We're more like saying, how do we stop this from happening mindset? Because we are saying, look, I just don't want to deal with it. Right? And therefore, we're We are focusing on error elimination. So error elimination requires stronger control, stronger quality control. And therefore, if I in the past have found out some interesting causes, I found certain root causes of certain classes of problems, then I tighten the process to a large degree and make it so strong, and hopefully with corresponding aids to do this, hopefully they are gone, right? So the control mechanism becomes important. So if you say I'm doing unit test, then it's very important to have a very strong control mechanism to ensure that the unit test is done well. And you can't just say, hey, I've got coverage, right? You need to be sure that the kinds of issues that a unit test is, for example, or early stage development test is catching is indeed caught, and it does not escape into the later stage. So you need some measures to measure and constantly tighten. And that's what I meant by gates, right? Or it could be certain coding practices. You might say, look, this is a standard that we are following for secure coding, for example, and you have no way to violate it. If you violate it, I will not be able to update. You can't push it in the version control system. So you have a strong gate to prevent code getting inside, right? And those could be certain practices that are imposed upon by a process. And you might say, look, I have got a constant integration pipeline, which will constantly run some stuff. And if that doesn't pass a certain thing, then it will not be integrated. And that's where your CI/CD kind of a pipeline comes in, because it's a automated way of enforcement of certain processes. And here it is talking about basically integration issues don't happen, right? And that's what we're trying to do. So it is a combination of both preempting and preventing, and that's the detail I wanted to allude to as far as the shift left is concerned. Now, one of the things that is now becomes important to ask is, okay, we talked about what issues, where, new versus old, and kind of looked at the difference between these two. So how do I do it? And that's where we can look at it as any kind of improvement, any kind of transformation, any kind of a change is three parts. Doing something with a process, which is more organizational oriented, doing something with a practice, which is more individual oriented, and finally, it is something that is aided to or helped by technology and tools. So it's done in three parts, right? So let's look at that. And then let's understand, if I want to put together a good shift left strategy, how these might help. So if I look at preemption and preventing, which is a combination for shift left, which we already talked about, what does it mean from a context of a process? So they're saying, look, as far as the process is concerned, as you can see on these two columns up here, when it talks of preemption, if I'm able to get a better definition and more code, better reviews in terms of code, in terms of stuff, maybe a more comprehensive strategy, all these are to some degree the idea of attempting to preempt some of the issues. Whereas doing a prototyping, doing a constant risk assessment at periodic points, doing a very iterative way of development and building and planning as a plan itself, by doing very iteratively, so that it's, maybe they're all acts of prevention from a process standpoint. When you look at it from a practice, which I think we are very aware, so when you say I'm doing TDD, or when you secure coding using OWASP, or I'm doing a lot of quality gates, they all lend itself to the notion of preemption from a practice point, which means you are hopefully mitigating via some of these. But when you say, look, I have to do this kind of testing at a stage, you are saying, look, you are doing early stage tests, you are doing something much better in terms of early stage evaluation. You're trying to prevent a problem, right? You're kind of saying, okay, I hope I'm not hoping, I'm going to block an errant module which is performance insensitive being integrated, because I have done a risk assessment. I understand that some of these components or some of these features are very performance sensitive, and therefore they must be evaluated for certain performance criteria. And if they don't meet, I'm sorry, you can't integrate. That's how you mix your process and practice. Let's say, for example, in a particular case of a non-functional piece. And other than the process, from a practice standpoint of test, we are also talking about the practice of better collaboration, better communication, more discussion, which I think we're all aware of in the agile context, which we practice every day. And the last and the final stuff is to look at it in summary notion of a fail fast mechanism. That means we are trying to prevent, let's do a few things as experiment and let's see if we can fail faster and learn and adjust and improve rather than always trying to find the right solution in the beginning. And that's also probably an interesting practice of experimenting and failing fast, learning from it and continuing on. This, I think, we're very aware, so I don't need to belabor this point too much. And that's where tools come in: automated testing, CI/CD, pipelines establishment, static code analysis tools, version controls tools. All these are preemption pieces, right? So when we automate and run and you're putting it in the pipeline, that's an example of preemption. What is preventing? Monitoring tools to find out few things and therefore, doing some simulations and using simulation tools. Maybe doing some dynamic code analysis, to find out certain elements of memory, consumption of certain patterns. Other administrative tools like trackers, etc., which are enforcement from a process angle. All these are prevention-related tool sets that could help. This is just to kind of help. We're just trying to break it down into prevention and prevention so that we can strategize better across process, practice, and tool. So to summarize and put it in a to kind of close this conversation, we started off by talking about the real reason for shift left is to optimize validation so that we can unshackle the capacity. And there are going to be many ways to unshackle capacity. One is to improve what we are doing very well. So that's the first level. That's the first level of transformation, right? So I am doing something, I'm doing much better. So therefore, I don't have too much of rework. Second, I'm doing as quickly as possible so that I create capacity because I'm faster. That's where some of these ideas and tools and lean processes, etc., come in. The third one is saying, hey, I can do unshackling by doing early. So the right order would be to kind of say, first, what I do neat well. That's the first part. Second, do whatever I do well, do it as quickly as possible. And now that I've done well, I've done quickly, it's probably important to kind of do as early. And that's what we talked about in shift left. And finally, the do less is about leverage. That means I've got standard test cases, standard scripts, some leveraging in terms of whatever assets that I have so that I can do much lesser work. So our focus in today's music was to a larger degree focused on shift left, which is about pulling it forward and therefore optimizing, which is one of the interesting things. And what did we talk about? We said, look, it is not just about saying, okay, I do reviews and automation and test and process. Yeah, that's what we do. But if you want to decompose that problem and have a little more better handle, be clear. You want to do early. Are you clear of what are the entities? Are you clear about what are you testing? Are you testing a feature? Are you testing a flow? Are you testing a component? Or are you testing an end user requirement? Be clear of it, and therefore you can allocate it appropriate roles and then put an appropriate process and put an appropriate practice and so on. Think in terms of prevention, think in terms of preemption, and therefore you can think in terms of a process, practice, and tools, right? And finally, do keep in mind that we are building something new. We are modifying something existing. So do a bit of a delineation between the fact of how do I do anything early in the context of a new, and what do I need to know in the context of a modified. And that's where we talked about the notion of I am impacting somebody, I am perturbing something else, and therefore in the context of modification, the risk is about me perturbing some other part of the system and therefore upsetting some of the quality criteria, so to speak. That in essence is what I wanted to to share as some interesting thoughts when it comes to how can I shift left, what should I do to shift left. And I thought this might be something interesting to share with you. So thank you for patiently listening, and I hope it was of some use to you.